one. I can just assure members of the public that although we haven't had a board in January, each of the boards have been kept fully abreast and involved in the operational challenges that we've faced. And in that regard, I'd like to start off the meeting by thanking my frontline teams in all of our trusts for their phenomenal efforts in delivering the best possible care they can do in what is extremely challenging, or have been extremely challenging circumstances, which I'm sure we'll touch on. I'd also like to thank the families who support our frontline teams for the work that they do, and our executive directors who, particularly when they're on call, have to cope with sleep interruptions, handling crisis situations overnight. On behalf of everyone in the geographies that the Foundation Group serves, I want to thank you. I also want to apologise, though, to members of the public and their families who have been experiencing very long delays in our urgent and emergency care units. Our teams continue to provide the best possible care they can, but certainly in terms of waiting times, we are aware that the waiting times have been much higher than are acceptable and is usual for us. So on behalf of all of the trusts, I want to apologise to you and thank you. We are making real progress, though, in terms of improvements. We'll touch on some of those, in particular around Worcester. And I just want to have a bit of a shout out for the team at Worcestershire in two aspects before we get the meeting going. The first is we're really seeing some very interesting innovations coming through in Worcestershire. We've introduced the idea of an ambulance pit stop, which is having quite a significant impact on handover times at our Worcester site in particular, and we're expecting to see that rolled out, and I'm sure Stephen Coleman will touch on that later. But also with respect to Worcestershire, in July 2022, before Worcestershire Group joined the Foundation Group, there were enforcement orders placed, undertakings placed on the trust in the areas of quality of care, cancer and elective recovery. Those enforcement notices were removed last week because of the improvement in performance. So I would like to thank everyone who's been involved in turning around that situation, albeit we have a lot further to go. We have certain apologies for absence today from Neil Cook, David Moon, Joe Newton, and Simon Page and Grace Quantock, and nice to see Joe Kerwin today deputising for Neil Cook. Any new declarations of interest? Could I ask you to raise a digital hand for me if you have any new declarations of interest? Paul Capener, please.
Yeah, Sarah asked me just to update that I no longer have a consulting company, and I now operate self-employed in the guise of Paul Capener Governance Services.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And Grace Quantock, you are here. Is that what you wanted to tell me with your hand up?
Two things. That was the one thing, and the other was just to make a declaration that I have joined the Judicial Appointments Commission.
Okay, congratulations. Congratulations, Grace. Okay, the last set of minutes held on the 6th of November. These have been discussed at the individual boards, but are there any points of accuracy colleagues would like to raise at this point? Please raise a digital hand. Can't see any digital hands raised there. So in terms of action points arising, we go to page 16. And the first action point was on some benchmarking work on EDs, and that's the subject of one of our deep dives later, so we'll come back to that. Thank you. Then on the Foundation Group performance report, Sophie was going to ensure the diagnostic wait times were covered. We're talking about that a bit later. And Sophie was also going to ensure on Adam Carson's behalf that the Swift Improvement Board meeting information be shared across the Foundation Group, and that was done. And I think the final one, which was covered off, was Gwenny was going to ensure that the member of the public's question about the complaints policy, Worcestershire Acute was covered off at that board, and it was. So thank you for that. So I think we're covered on all of those. And I am delighted to welcome back Adam Carson after a period of illness. Adam, you've hit the road running. It's really great to have you back amongst us and within the family again. So are there any matters arising that colleagues feel I've missed? Okay, well, for members of the public in particular, we've had a board workshop this morning where we covered off three things. We were delighted to have John Drew from NHS England's Midlands region join us to talk about the staff survey generally, our results in particular, and some real shout outs there in terms of the improvements we're seeing across the foundation group, with Swift still being the pathfinder on the staff survey results. And we are awaiting the final results for the most recent survey, but we are very optimistic that they will see some significant continued improvements. It is part of the philosophy and culture and belief system in the foundation group that we work heavily on the staff survey results to create a culture for our staff where they enjoy working for us and with us. And through that, we're able to provide levels of care which are amongst the very best in the NHS. We then had a session on clinical digital safety led by Rebecca, which is particularly important given the developments in AI and electronic patient records which are occurring across the foundation group. And then finally, we discussed one of our other big moves, which was being a very flexible employer, which at one level for some people might seem part of the modern world and a big change from the way some of us started off our working life, where employers weren't very flexible. But it absolutely is essential if we're going to retain our most experienced and talented staff, to bring down sickness and to ensure that we are absolutely the place that people with a need to balance life can find a work harmony which allows them to work for us, with us, and be productive with us. Glenn, was there anything else on the foundation group workshops you think I haven't covered?
I thought it was a great summary, Chairman. I was particularly pleased to see some of the science to back up my feelings that the staff survey is the most important indicator that crosses our desks each year, and as you say, that we will see the latest staff survey probably by the time we next meet as individual boards. That will be published, and we'll look at that in a lot of detail. But that connection between that and all aspects of performance, quality, safety, productivity is really, really important. And I think there is a link into being a very flexible employer, because you give someone, you get a lot more back from our workforce as a result of that. So it's good to see that particular connection. So yeah, we will include all of the data as soon as we have it in our board packs.
Fantastic, thank you, Glenn. Okay, team, well, we'll move on then to the performance review and updates and the foundation group performance report. And I think we're going to do it in our normal order as per the summary pack. And that, I think, means Jane Ives. First of all, Jane, over to you.
And good afternoon. So I guess what I'd say in summary in terms of the Wye Valley performance is good progress, but so I was going to start off talking about urgent care, and as you said, Russell, performance has been challenged over the winter period nationally. So when we look at our performance, we're actually above the national and regional averages on ED performance. Nearly half of our emergencies are now managed on the same day through the same day emergency care service that we run. Increasing numbers of patients are being managed in urgent community response, and so they're not even getting to hospital, they're being referred through ambulance calls and through others. So that's helping with demand. So all of that is really good, but as we started today, we've still got 30 patients who are in temporary escalation spaces and 20 patients who are waiting in ED for an emergency bed. So despite all of that good work and the metrics showing that it's making a difference, it's not making enough difference yet. So as we come to planning for next year, emergency care, emergency pathways, reducing the demand for acute emergency beds is absolutely at the heart of what we're planning to do next year, because we'll achieve little else if we don't make even more progress on that. So it's absolutely at the heart of our planning as we're looking at next year. Well, look at our elective care metrics. Again, lots of positive progress, improvements in productivity, high activity levels. I think we're still at the top or very near the top in terms of regionally how much more work we do now than we did pre-COVID. So really pleasing progress on that. But we know we can do better still, and we know we can do better with productivity. And so again, that's very much part of our planning for next year. And then the last thing I wanted to end on, which probably doesn't have so much of a but, is to talk about our Cancer 62-day performance. So some real improvement that's happened over the year with really meticulous, detailed pathway improvement right across those cancer pathways. So we are very nearly meeting next year's targets for cancer now. So I'm really confident that we'll meet those targets next year. So a mixed picture as always, but certainly some good progress.
Thank you very much, Jane. Jane, just because it's going to be something I ask each of the colleagues, because it does relate to system working, how many medically fit for discharge patients do we have roughly today?
Have 34 this morning, and of those, 16 are from Powys, so a disproportionate number of patients who wait for discharge into Powys as wait for discharge into Herefordshire.
Thank you, Jane. And just before we move on, for members of the public, the flow efficiency, how effectively our system flows, is disproportionately dependent on when people are ready to go home, then being able to go home with a social care package if that's available. And that is one of the real opportunities that we must seize in all of the trusts in the year ahead. Over to you, Adam, for your summary, please.
Thank you very much, Russell. It would be remiss of me not to start with the Trust winning the HSJ Trust of the Year award, as I don't think we've had a group board since then. Recognised a number of factors across the Trust, obviously performance, culture, improvement work we're doing, but most notably our staff and the hard work that they put in every day. So really it's their award, and well done to them. Beyond that, I want to talk a bit about urgent care, and the themes really are very similar to those that Jane has already discussed. We had a challenging December, which became an even more challenging January, culminating in us calling our first critical incident at the start of January. We were challenged with both the number of people we were seeing and how unwell people were, which clearly compromised the flow in our hospitals. We're doing a lot of work on data to understand that a bit more, but one of the drivers remains the amount of out-of-area activity we're seeing, and Swift is one of the biggest importers of activity from other areas in the West Midlands, and that includes from within our own system. So just to give some idea of the context there, between April 2023 and January 2025, we saw a 99% increase in attendances from Coventry postcodes and 154% increase in Coventry admissions, and we saw a 169% increase in attendances from patients from Rugby and a 233% increase in admissions, and that sets against growth in South Warwickshire activity itself as 18%. So you can see that real growth we're seeing in out-of-area patients, the clear impact it's having on us. We're working with system colleagues to understand that, but clearly, just considering the size of our estate alone, let alone the financial factors, it's not a sustainable position, and we're going to have to manage that really closely going forwards. Before you ask the question, Russell, we have currently got 51 medically fit for discharge patients and have our usual plans in place for supporting those. The biggest challenge with medically fit for discharge is the out of area. Again, it's much harder to discharge those out of area patients from our hospital. Couple of other areas to highlight. I want to particularly highlight the work of our teams on the faster diagnosis standard, which is reporting as 84% for this month. That's been taking into account a really considerable improvement over the last year, and I'm really proud of the work our teams have done on that, which is reflected in the performance. Need to acknowledge, though, that there's some fragility here, and the next few months in particular are going to be challenging, driven by the very high number of referrals we're seeing, particularly over the busy periods we've got in the rest of the hospital. And finally, I want to mention sickness rates. So we've seen a slight increase of sickness rates across the winter, as you'd expect, and we're being watchful of that. But clearly that is having an impact on our services, and we're doing some work with our managers to understand and support particularly staff on long-term sickness, but sickness generally. And we're also reviewing our sickness management policy to support that. So I think those are the key things this month, Russell.
Thank you very much, Adam. And we'll move on then to Catherine, please, for George Eliot.
Thank you, Russell. Similar themes, unsurprisingly. So we too had a very busy winter. Obviously, for all of us, were impacted by a national increase in flu and a very bad flu season, which hit earlier than usual. Usually it's in January, but that was in December that affects these figures. And at 68.2%, that was our worst 4-hour performance for the calendar year. Though you can see in terms of that was sort of average across the Midlands. But it's been compounded for us by a bed occupancy, which you can see on here is 99.3%. And our medically fit for discharge number at the moment is 58. So that is 2 wards of patients that could be cared for in another setting, yet remain in our hospital beds. And without that number of patients in the beds, we wouldn't have patients in temporary escalation spaces, and we wouldn't have long waits in the emergency department. So it is an area that we need to tackle with our system partners, because it could make such a difference to patient experience. To our performance, and also in terms of cost efficiency. So it's something that has been a priority for us all year and will continue to be so. What I'd like to highlight to you is the same day emergency care metric on here. As you can see from the accompanying graph, our activity through our same day emergency care pathway is 47%. And you can see that's increased throughout the course of the year. We've invested heavily as an organisation in our surgical assessment unit, in our medical same-day emergency care, and through things like the virtual wards. But that has helped us to treat patients in different settings and avoid admission to hospital where possible. But no doubt our emergency pathway remains very challenged. Despite that, we have managed to protect our elective work, and you'll see continued good performance in our ERF delivery. We saw 14 patients waiting over 65 weeks, which is abnormal for us. We've been at 0 or 1 or 2. That was mainly down to patient choice in the run up to Christmas, which is understandable. But we're working very hard to try and reduce and eliminate completely 65 weeks and really tackle patients over 52 weeks, who it's an unacceptable wait of time for people to receive treatment. The area where I think we need to continue to maintain focus is on our cancer performance, and you'll see, particularly in the faster diagnostic performance, we slipped down to, again, a low level there. That was driven predominantly by an increase in breast cancer referrals following the national campaign and delays in imaging reporting. Those both also have a knock on to the 62-day performance. I can report that currently our faster diagnostic standards improved to 75%. But this is a standard that's fluctuating a bit with us, and we're working with our teams at the moment to review all of our cancer pathways and our diagnostic pathways that support those in order to streamline and take out inefficiencies, delays and blockages for patients, so we can treat this important group of patients reliably and quickly in line with the national standards. So that's what I'd like to say. Thanks, Russell.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I will invite questions and perspectives to all of the MDs in just a minute, but we'll hear from Stephen first. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks. So I'm going to mainly concentrate on urgent and emergency care. Some similarities, but some differences with other parts of the group. And probably apologies. Obviously, we see the data kind of almost every hour, the way we're living it currently. So a lot of the references that I'll give are kind of particularly what's coming through to kind of give a foresight to the board and members of the public. So we've seen a particular deterioration around our urgent and emergency access standard, and we did continue to really struggle with long ambulance handover delays, and some of that deterioration wasn't acceptable. We've taken a lot of steps around it. We've had a lot of discussion with NHSE around that as well. But there are some context that I think is helpful for people to know as we go into that. So particularly around November, we introduced a new EPR system, which we know when others have done that in ED has a knock on to its EAS, and that definitely contributed. We were also undertaking that significant work around the floor, and that moved itself through, but it definitely had a lag on into December. And then we were compounded, similar to, as Catherine said, we felt flu and we felt it quite hard. Hereford and Worcestershire at one point was on second only to the Birmingham area in terms of flu and COVID patients we were managing. That was 150 at its peak across our sites, which, while it didn't close beds, really restricted the movement that we could make and the difficulty around that and the timeliness around that. We've also seen increase in walk-in attendance, which we are working through with NHSE colleagues, is likely to be linked to the ambulance handover delays. So actually the quantum of patients can shift between one and the other, and as you improve one, you see that do. And the other thing, as we were going into winter, we had 24 beds out of it as well. So as well as our escalation space, we were restricted down to 24 beds. We had to find a way, and we have done that with the risks around that of putting that back in. However, through all that, as we've come through, we've started to see some kind of, I would say, rapid improvement, particularly around ambulance handover delays. And you referenced that, I've got to think of a better phrase for it, the pit stop on the Worcester Royal site, which is ACP led, that if you know the site, as they drive on to where the ODD and our rest decks are, patients receive a 5-10 minute assessment from an ACP. What we've seen is we were already improving the number of patients that were going through our surgical, medical and cardiology SDEC. We've actually seen that number has continued to grow, but the acuity has shifted. So they're actually pulling patients straight in, and we're watching that through the conversion rate. That is a better patient experience, because these are people that were likely to have a protracted delay on the ambulances. The knock-on has actually been into the night at the Worcester Royal site, and we've stopped diverting as much to the Alex. So it doesn't look big numbers, but that simple taking down one of the queue is having a disproportionately dramatic effect, we think, and we're continuing to monitor that. The other thing that has happened, particularly I would say around the second week of January, and Chris and I have been doing a lot of work around it, Chris has been doing the work, I'm just reporting it back, is around the discharge profile of the trust. And in terms of simple discharges, there's been quite a dramatic step change. So what we're starting to see is more regular days where we are either hitting our target or just under it, but it's consistently high. And the culmination of that work we saw at this weekend, where we were doing 70 to 80 discharges at a weekend, which prior to what we've done before was almost double. That's simple discharges that we're doing. So that's the teams restructuring. And there's a lot of talk around Worcester Acute and how it discharges. And I think we're starting to see some real benefit there. But we've still got a lot to go. So in answer to your question, Russell, we've got 133 patients who have no criteria to reside in the hospital. And that really focusing me on the bits of work that we've got to do going into the year are one around that continued demand management of the front door, but particularly integrating with community services and the work around frailty and trauma. And I think that's the next step change really for Worcestershire as a place, is that we need to we've got programs in place, but we need to accelerate them, and that 133 needs to come down and be quicker at how fast people move out of the hospital. So that's my summary. I just wanted to focus on those areas.
No, really helpful, Stephen. And the pit stop, it does do what it says on the tin, is really helpful in that regard. Just before I invite questions, the reason I'm focusing on medically fit for discharge, particularly for members of the public and system colleagues, Glenn briefed all of the non-execs this morning on the real challenges financially that the NHS is facing in 25-26. If you do some simple maths, and Chris has done some at Worcestershire, which is along the lines I'm about to describe, but based on the numbers today, there are over 250 people medically fit for discharge in our 4 acute trusts at an average net saving of £300. It's £450 to stay in an acute bed overnight on average. If you say going to another care setting would cost £150, and you times that by the 250, you times it by 365 days, there is over £27 million. £27 million of net saving across the foundation group if, with our system partners, we're able to address this issue of medically fit for discharge and flow efficiency. We're doing everything we can to work with system partners, but we do need to find different ways of working with social care and with system partners to be able to free up that money. But that is money in their hills, as one might say. So with that sort of contextualisation of why medically fit for discharge is so important, questions and perspectives to our MDs. Glenn?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the urgent care issue, as you suggest, Russell. I think not only is there the issue of difficulty in discharging patients, but obviously at certain points in the year, and we've certainly going through one at the moment, the demand increases and the length of stay increases. And all of those things add to the challenges of safety and quality, but also the financial challenges of the NHS. So I've been hugely impressed with the way all 4 trusts have responded to this year, because that wave of various illnesses all hit at the same time in that post-Christmas period particularly. I get an hourly report from West Midlands Ambulance Service that shows me how long ambulances are waiting outside EDs across the whole of the Midlands. And our trust generally not holding ambulances. Worcester has been a problem, but as Stephen said, over the last couple of weeks, it's been great to see that the Worcester ambulance handover delays have dropped significantly, and hopefully that's a position we can maintain. I was also pleased to see the planning guide, so you wouldn't often hear me saying this, that landed last week across the NHS, because that brings with it the opportunity to look carefully at demand changes in each trust. A lot of the contracts that we have at the moment were set during the COVID years, so they're block contracts. They've not been increased. In fact, they've been reduced through annual efficiency expectations. So they don't really reflect the demand that we're seeing now. So within the planning guidance, we will be calculating the activity versus the price, so we can really be clear about where we have productivity challenges and where we have demand issues. And those demand issues either need to be funded in the place in which the activity is taking place, so we can build greater capacity to improve safety, or they need to be referred into more appropriate settings. The latter actually is much more of a preference. So getting patients home, avoiding admission, but those conversations will be happening over the next few weeks as we plan for next year. So it's a really important thing that we look across the NHS at where the productivity challenges are once we've done that reset.
No, well said, Glenn. And on your starting point, it is worth just making members of the public aware, for George Eliot and Swift, the Coventry and Warwickshire ICB has got the fastest growing population of any ICB in England. 7% population growth in the last 3 years alone. So the demand challenges that our teams are experiencing aren't going to go away. If anything, they are going to increase, but we do, as Glenn has said, need to do more on flow efficiency and prevention. Paul Capener, over to you.
Obviously, there's some areas across group where we're not performing as well as the national targets would hope we would. I mean, that's inevitable, I guess. So the one area that I rarely hear any sort of serious focus on, or at least detail at boards, is outpatients. So we're read across the board, every organisation, on DNAs and slot utilisation. And I just wonder, is there a sufficient focus there? Because given the national agenda will be fewer targets, more of a push on RTT, obviously that very first important step is being seen for the first time. So yeah, just interested to know whether we feel a sufficient focus on outpatients across the board.
No, great question. Yeah, no, great question. There is a lot going on, but Glenn, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll perhaps just come in on behalf of all 4 trusted managing directors. If you want to correct me on anything, please do. There is a lot of focus on this, Paul. In fact, it's one of the 2 priorities that the Learning Improvement Networks have identified in terms of improving outpatient productivity. All 4 trusts have been part of the Further Faster national initiative to improve productivity in outpatients, and that brings with it a focus on each of the individual specialties and some best practice guides, which have been really, really useful. And actually, when you look at the performance across the board, we're generally good. I mean, some of the DNA targets are locally set, they're not nationally set. So we're in some cases setting ourselves some stretch improvements. Probably be worth us doing a bit of a drill down into some of the things that we've been doing on this. So there's been, for example, George Eliot doing work using AI and volunteers to contact patients to reduce DNAs, productivity improvement work in other parts of the group, looking at how many patients we put into individual slots, removing and reducing the number of follow-ups, so we concentrate on first outpatients. So lots of work there. So maybe it's one area that we could do a bit of a drill down on at some point soon.
Let's take that away, Glenn. I think it's a good call. And Sarah Leitstrick?
Thanks. Mine was a question really relating to some of the pressures we've found over winter and influenza. We mentioned it at the George Eliot, one of our George Eliot meetings, but whether we've triangulated we know there's been a lower uptake of flu vaccination, both in our staff and in the public. Have we triangulated those admissions? Were people admitted, vaccinated or not? And would this be an area for research for the future and perhaps some further work going forwards? Absolutely understanding people's right to make an informed choice about vaccination, but I think it's important regarding the winter pressures.
No, good challenge there. So I'm not aware of any triangulation that's been done, but maybe I'm wrong. Catherine?
No, we haven't done any triangulation on that, Sarah. I think that might have come up in Quack when we were talking about things. So one thing I would say to members of the public and to our own staff is that flu vaccination rates this year have been particularly low. George Eliot's worked pretty hard on this and probably has one of the better vaccination rates across the Midlands, but still too late in the season and a long way short of where our vaccination rates for staff, during the COVID pandemic were. So I think there is a key message to the public that it's not too late for most people still to have up until March flu vaccinations, and certainly for next year, making sure that we are vaccinating our staff. You can see across all of us, our staff sickness went up very significantly in December. But there is an important message about vaccination rates and how we are pushing that as much as we could be in order to protect staff and the public.
Thank you, Catherine. It does sound as though we need to be ahead of the curve next year, like you indicate. And David Mobley makes an important point, which we need to just pick up. It would be good to see perinatal mortality for all the trusts and against a national mean, if we can maybe take that forward. Are there any other questions to our MDs on the performance reports? Okay, so we'll move on then to the diagnostics deep dive and over to our chief operating officers and chief medical officers. Who's first in flow?
Hello, it's me, Harkamar from Swift. So really pleased to present our diagnostic deep dive with you all, because diagnostics does underpin absolutely everything that we do. And we've talked about it on and off throughout our boards and referenced it in our slides, but demand is rising. And that isn't just because we are treating more patients, as we've sort of talked about already, but NICE guidance increasingly recommends diagnostics to support clinical decision making. So across a variety of pathways, you will see more requests for diagnostics to be really, really early on to improve outcomes, pathways, and reduce delays. And then this is reflected in the elective recovery plan, where it really sets out quite clearly what the expectations are for organisations to provide adequate diagnostics. That's not without its challenges. Infrastructure can be really challenging. Access to trained staff is increasingly difficult, and making sure that we've got capacity in the right place, in the right bit of the system to meet that demand has become more and more complex as recommendations change. As a view nationally, you can see that, so this is the top right graph, you can see that overall the number of patients on waiting lists is increasing. Waiting lists do continue to grow, and the overall number of tests carried out continues to grow. When you look then at the big graph, which is the foundation group, although the number of tests carried out is increasing, the waiting list size overall is a bit more stable, so not necessarily reflecting that national picture, but still meeting, quite clearly demonstrating that we're meeting that demand in terms of requests for additional tests. We've included a slide about what the capacity looks like across the foundation group, and I won't go through all of this, but it does set out quite easily what each organisation has got and where it is. So across the top, you'll see whether that's at an acute site or a clinical diagnostic centre, so the CDCs, just so that members of the board have got a bit of a view of the variety of locations that we're providing diagnostic services at. In terms of waiting times, you'll see, and this reflects what the other slide sort of says, in terms of the number of patients waiting at the end of the month for tests by organisation, we are fairly stable in terms of our waiting list. You'll see in some organisations we have seen significant decreases in the overall number of patients waiting, so notably at Swift and at Wye Valley. When you look at the number of patients waiting over 6 weeks, again, Swift and Wye Valley have seen quite significant improvements, as have Worcester. George Eliot have always remained quite strong on the number of patients waiting over 6 weeks, and then forward that on in the pathway to the number of patients waiting over 13 weeks. The 3 trusts have managed to reduce their numbers quite significantly, and I think you'll see that Worcester remain with quite a significant challenge there, and that's driven in part due to complexity along these pathways. So it's perhaps not surprising that we would see some of that at Worcester. That said, diagnostics is complicated, and it's more than just imaging. I think normally when you think about diagnostics, you'll think about CT and MRI, but actually physiological measurement, endoscopy is also a really important area of diagnostics and presents its own demand. And I think when you hopefully have taken the time to go through some of these slides in detail, you'll see that actually the challenges by organisation are quite different. So George Eliot, whilst they have overall stable waiting lists and lower number of patients waiting the longest, DEXA scans for over 6 weeks and 13 weeks remain a challenge. Albeit, I must point out that they are small numbers. For Swift, we've really struggled with audiology, and whilst that is a national picture, it's not necessarily replicated in the same way across the foundation group. And the slides don't necessarily reflect this, but non-obstetric ultrasound was also a really key challenge for us, and we were really lucky to get some much needed mutual aid from George Eliot, which has helped improve our position considerably. With Worcester, you'll see that audiology is also a challenge there, and I think that talks to some of that national picture, but also the demand on MRI over at Worcester. For Wye Valley, although there are fragilities across all of their diagnostics, it's really important to remember the previous slide, which talked to the overall improvement in waiting times. And I think the bit I'd pick out of this slide for members would be the waits for cystoscopy, and also along the neurophysiology pathway. That's another area where we really do struggle with access to trained staff and that can provide quite a challenge. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Harkamel. So just moving on in terms of obviously what Harkamel's talked about is about access to the actual diagnostic, but the other challenge for diagnostics is around turnaround times for reporting as well, so that our clinicians who are requesting those diagnostics understand what those diagnostics are telling us. So looking at this slide, there is fairly consistent good performance around A&E reporting within 4 hours, with a slightly lower percentage within 4 hours at Wye Valley. If I can just draw the board's attention to the bottom left-hand chart, which talks about urgent inpatient reporting, I'm conscious that the figures on there do look low compared to some of the other numbers on the other charts on there, and that is because in that table it does include plain film X-rays, which isn't something that we usually hot report. So if we were to take that out, the turnaround time for the urgent inpatient reporting would improve significantly, but it is consistent in terms of it being included for all members of the foundation group. There are other challenges around turnaround times in a number of areas that are highlighted on there, particularly for George Eliot, around cancer pathways within 3 days and the urgent GP and outpatients within 3 days. But if we can move the slide on, Harkamel. And let's talk about some of the narrative around some of the challenges. So reporting capacity, as I said, is a particular challenge and is linked to the increase in demand for diagnostics. There is some variation across the group in the percentages, but also in terms of how we're addressing it locally within our different organisations. So we're all looking about how we can increase our workforce and changing practice around access to and turnaround times for reporting for diagnostics. But increasingly, partners are also using external companies and outsourcing reporting for some diagnostics, which is supporting turnaround times to increase, but does come with other challenges around high cost and potentially access. If we can skip on another slide, Harkamel, thank you. So looking more broadly at the challenges, it's clear there's a number of challenges across a range of modalities, and I think it's sort of set out here for all the foundation group members around where some of those challenges are. But also for me, that presents a number of opportunities where we can clearly see that some members of the group are doing better in some areas or have particular challenges that other members of the group can support with, and look at how we can do things differently into further opportunities. Consistently across the group, there's more work we need to do about the sustainability of workforce, particularly for testing and the reporting capacity, and that links to, as Harkamel described, the increasing demand, not just because of treating more patients, but also because of the NICE guidance in terms of requiring more tests. And then on to the next one, Harkamel, please. But there is also some real successes across the group, and actually we've all managed to reduce our backlogs overall, and I think that's a real success across the group and not something that's necessarily replicated everywhere. And as Harkamel described that graph right at the beginning, which says that we're doing more tests and sustaining a waiting list position in terms of total volumes that others are struggling to do. Across the group, we've also seen more progress on community diagnostic hubs developments, and whilst there are in different stages of development, that clearly is linked to part of the elective reform plan going forward to support developments of diagnostics across the region. And again, just demonstrating lots of positive progress and opportunities. There is more work we want to do though, and I think this piece of work that we've coordinated has just led us to ask a lot more questions about things we want to take forward as a group and where we can benefit from locally. So more we want to learn about within what's going on around elective and that real understanding of capacity. There is I'm particularly interested in how we're using our resource in terms of those machines or some of those big diagnostics that have significant capital investment requirements, and actually, how do we compare in terms of the number of CTs per machine that we're able to get through across the foundation group. And there's then opportunities to work differently where we might have access to estates, but we might not have access to workforce in one organisation, how we can work differently across the group. And then thinking about how we look to the elective pathways and diagnostics in terms of how we are, where in pathways we are doing diagnostics and how we're doing that in line with best practice. We've heard from a number of the managing directors around cancer fast diagnosis standard and how we can streamline some of the diagnostic elements of that will enable us to tell patients whether they have or haven't got cancer more quickly and improve our performance of the 28-day standard. clearly lots to do around productivity as well. It's not something that we traditionally have looked at in the same way that we do for traditional outpatients or traditional inpatients, but more about understanding how we can look at our DNA rates for diagnostics, our patient and hospital cancellations, and how many times we're repeating diagnostics in a short period of time, and where that adds value. I think I'm now going to hand over to a CMO to talk about the Chief Medical Officer's perspective on issues and opportunities. Thanks, Bhaskar.
Thank you, Chris. So just reviewing the data, as a group of CMOs, we just pulled out 3 areas where we thought perhaps we'll look at the challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities it gives for us to work together. So the first one was about workforce issues. Across all our trusts, there are many areas where we have limited specialist skills. And that gives us the opportunity to think about perhaps putting the expertise across the foundation. There are opportunities as well because of the vacancies we have and the fact that in many of our areas we do use expensive insourcing. So there are examples where, for instance, in George Eliot, where they use the clinical fellows. So opportunities again to learn from each other. Now, as we just presented, we can see that the demand for diagnostic across different modalities are increasing, and that will be multifactorial, but again, gives us opportunities to share best practice in terms of demand management, ensuring that we have clear pathways and criteria for referral. Now, the promise of AI raises a number of opportunities, both in increasing diagnostic accuracy, as well as improving productivity and efficiency. Obviously, we need to consider the risks and ethics of it. So it's exciting to hear that George Eliot was trying AI to assist in musculoskeletal plain film reporting in emergency department. Again, this raises opportunities for us to learn from each other as we try to grapple with all the opportunities that AI provide. I'll pass on to any of the other chief medical officers that want to comment.
Thanks, Chizo. I think I just add that, yes, the demand is growing, and while our testing has improved and waiting is reasonably managed, that's come under cost pressure as well. And it's the reporting challenges that remain the issue, and the sporadic scarcity of expertise in some locations like pediatric reporting or whatnot. And not want to take any sting off our AI guru, but AI in radiology is still an evolution. And while plain X-ray and CT head, we get some leeway with AI. The main backlogs is with cross-sectional CTs and MRI, where AI has still got a way to get there. So I don't want to take any hope out of it, but it's not an immediate solution, is something I need to clarify here. Thank you, Chizo.
And Naj?
Yeah, just on the AI bit. So as it's mentioned in the presentation, we've been running a trial here since December. And what we found already is an improvement in productivity and some quality, but mainly the productivity. So those that know the geography of George Eliot, the urgent treatment centre is on one edge of the department, and our clinicians are having to traipse right the way across the other side to find a consultant to report it. Well, we've cut that out, so we've already seen that they're able to report much quicker. The reports, and those reports are then reviewed by a consultant the following day, and we've not found any sort of risks or anything significant missed. On the background of that, also, we're looking at chests now coming online. There's this targeted lung health check which is going on in the community, and they're using some AI as well. And I was speaking to one of our radiologists, how good a system that is at picking up abnormalities. One of the weaknesses of these is that they only see the image at that time, and radiologists, if there's one here, they like to refer and compare with previous images, which AI hasn't got the capability to do at the moment. I'm sure some bright spark is working on that, how AI can not only look at the image today, but compare it to the one in the previous one. But I think there's a great future for AI in imaging.
No, great. Thanks, Naj. I mean, it does seem one of those really exciting areas where fragile services, mutual aid, avoiding insourcing by doing it together and applying AI should be able to drive a lot of productivity and an improvement in those waiting times. Any questions or perspectives to colleagues on the diagnostics deep dive? So who's the driving force? Sorry, David. Go to David Mowbray first.
I'm just thinking, Russell, there's a lot of work which I certainly wasn't cited on as CMO, and possibly things have changed, with the West Midlands Imaging Network, about sharing images, sharing reporting, and having a single platform, and getting them along to one of these sessions. I think would be useful just to broaden what is going on, because they do seem to be on it, but it's an interesting development that I wasn't aware of.
And so just building on that, David, I mean, my sort of question was partly related to your experience. Who's the driving force within our teams on this issue? How do we make sure that we have someone who is the prime mover? Glenn?
Well, he just spoke, Russell. So I've asked David, and David is starting to convene a forum of, particularly in radiology, the clinical and operational leads, just to start this conversation. I mean, that's not in itself going to solve it, but I think from that we will probably see some emerging leadership opportunities to look at this across the group. As David said, I think one of the key enablers for this is a common reporting platform across, I mean, ideally across the whole Midlands, hence the West Midlands Imaging Network being a good solution for that, because they also have access to capital. And then I think the other area that's fast approaching that one is histopathology through digitisation, also the ability to do that, not only to improve productivity and to manage our kind of highs and lows of capacity across the group, but also to allow individuals to subspecialise, which is also a good way of recruiting and retaining consultants, particularly. So I think those two areas are going to be moving forward. So we'll get that group together. It may well be something that we need to put a little bit of operational resource into in order to make sure that we get the best from it. So that's something that will go to group strategy committee if that's what we need.
Yeah, no, histopathology is, as we know, Glenn, through the Commentary and Warwickshire Pathology Service, as well as the idea of the South Midlands Pathology Service across the whole of the Foundation Group, is an enormous opportunity for us to see improvements in performance and value for money for taxpayers. So I think it is very important for us to keep that on our radar. Any other questions or perspectives to colleagues? Okay, well, it will be interesting to see, Mr. Mowbray, how you take this forward, and we look forward to being briefed in due course. So we'll move on then to the emergency department benchmarking, which we've touched on a bit so far. But again, back over to my chief operating officers and CFOs this time. Back with you.
Thank you, Russell. And that's me, Andy Parker, and I'll be ably assisted by Katie Osmond for this. So Gwenny, I think you're going to share the slides for us, and I'll just spend just 5-6 minutes, Russell, just quickly going through these so you've got plenty of time for questions. So the exam question that was behind this benchmarking was raised by Glenn at our last Foundation Group board, and that is around the challenge around increased funding in ED, and could that be redirected to support admission avoidance and improving discharges. I think I'd like to just start off by saying this is very much work in progress, and as a summary of the benchmarking review and some of the initial analysis we've done to date, but very much work in progress. Next slide, please, Gwenny. As we've all mentioned already, we've all faced a really challenging winter so far, both for system urgent and emergency care pathways, and particularly for our EDs. The pandemic of flu A, flu B, COVID and RSV has presented many IPC challenges for our EDs, along with, as already mentioned, high ED attendances and high admissions. But this is no longer a winter issue, and we're seeing this is all year round pressure. It just seems to accumulate in a significant way in our winter periods. Pressure in ED is often an indicator of a wider trust-widening system health and social care issues across our places and counties. And to address this, various methods and various work schemes have been put in place to address ED congestion, whether that's virtual wards, urgent community response teams, empowering neighbourhood teams, or working with our local authorities around discharge delays and discharge managements, as you've already mentioned yourself, Russell. And internal schemes also to address flow, length of stay, as well as improving our ED practices. And often these result in us having to provide support to our EDs because of congestion, through additional resources to maintain patient safety, to manage escalation during periods of high congestion, and that often results in additional staffing, whether that's substantive or temporarily, as well as surge areas either inside or outside RED. So this piece of work is looking at how this piece of work is what we've already started, and it's understanding the current state of our ED productivity, identifying opportunities, and where costs could be utilised elsewhere to improve patient pathways and access across our systems. Next slide, please, Gwenny. So in order to measure and compare our EDs in a uniformed way, we've looked at Model Hospital, which collects data in the same way for each of our trusts. New on Model Hospital is the summary ED indicator table, which uses elements of the emergency care improvement teams, support teams, summary acute provider information table, and other trust data, and is collated into one place. This provides detail on how our EDs and our urgent care pathways perform, looking at demand, capacity, flow and outcomes, and how each ED across the group is unique, and information about productivity needs further interpretation and reviewing, and helps us to point into areas of inquisitive behaviour, and looks to pull out where we can improve and contrast and compare across our EDs in our foundation group. Next slide, please, Gwenny. So all our EDs are increasingly congested and are struggling to get to pre-COVID levels of 4-hour emergency access standard. Each of our EDs, which is shown here, is different in their specific challenges, and this is a snapshot and an indicator of January, but it's indicative of all year round, and shows how our acuity, the admission age and attendance age for each of our EDs is significantly different. And such factors of acuity and patient demographics vary across our EDs, along with the operational clinical models that we have in place, whether they're urgent treatment centres co-located with our EDs, paediatric services that are maintained across our various trusts, whether our EDs are trauma centres, acute stroke pathways, all that have a bearing on our acuity and the age ranges that we have, as well as the geography of each of our EDs served, and the social economic factors as well, and the location and proximity to some of our tertiary centres. Next slide, please, Gwenny. So this shows the high-level performance data around admission, attendances and conversion to admissions, along with some of the challenges we have with length of stay across our EDs, showing the different degree of challenges we are faced at each site. Each site at various times has bottlenecks within their ED for a variety of reasons, and each has differing solutions and resources to address these challenges. That is in place to maintain patient safety, particularly during surge periods, and they are both temporary and substantive solutions. But as you can see, 12 hours in particular varies across our foundation group, and we know that's one of the key drivers for the urgent care business operational planning guidance for 25-26. Next slide, please, Gwenny. And I'll hand over to Katie to this particular section.
Thank you, Andy, and afternoon, colleagues. So what this slide starts to draw out is some financial analysis specifically looking at our front doors. So it's an early piece of work across the teams. It builds on some of that existing work that we've already standardised across group in terms of the review of cost per weighted activity unit as a measure. And this derives from some analysis that colleagues in Swift have started to develop. So a big thank you to our finance teams for working closely together over the last couple of weeks to align some of the methodology in this so that we can be broadly confident that we can compare across the organisations. What this is helping us to do is to look at the resources that are utilised at our front doors relative to our workforce levels, volumes of patients and the time that our patients spend in the department. And I think it's fair to say that broadly this does triangulate with those performance metrics that Andy has described. So where we see that increased demand, increased acuity of our patients and longer patient time in the department, we can evidence that that drives an increased use of resources and quite often at premium rates, which drives a cost premium. We know that we incur additional costs at our front doors and in safely managing congestion through those urgent care pathways that we've touched on quite a bit already today. And we often do that in quite a reactive way to demand pressures, which is what drives some of that premium in the cost base. As Andy touched on, that increased spend isn't just seen in our emergency departments, but we see it throughout the pathway in how we utilise and staff our temporary escalation spaces and how we manage our discharge pathways. So we know that there is a premium associated with congestion and demand in our urgent care pathways that we see across our organisations. So what do we do with this early intelligence next? So each organisation we know has got different estate configurations, workforce models, patient cohorts, all of the intelligence that Andy's just flashed up. So we've got some really useful intelligence and benchmarking to start us off. And we now need to use this to look at how we better understand some of those drivers of variation throughout the urgent care pathway and particularly at the front door, and how we convert those into opportunities to better utilise those resources in a more planned way going forward. Andy, back to you, I think. Next slide.
Thanks, Katie. So what next and what actions do we need to take? So I think we all know and recognise that there is still more to do in terms of ED productivity and ED efficiency within our actual EDs themselves. But there's further work to do to understand the cost differences, as Katie's already explained, and how to decongest our ED will improve the cost per patient. We need to look at our workforce models across our foundation group and what learning we can undertake there. In Wye Valley, for example, we've implemented or are about to implement or are implementing a new workforce model across our ED, and that was built on working across our foundation group and then looking what is working well across our foundation group colleagues and what more we can learn from our workforce models as well. So the urgent treatment centre at George Eliot, for example, how is that improving their flow? And we know that's a key initiative as part of business planning and operational planning for the next year and how we can implement what is working across George Eliot. But also looking at other costs across our trust, as Katie has already mentioned, this is not just unique to ED. We put investment and premium spend both substantively and temporarily into managing our escalation beds, managing our temporary escalation spaces, how we can right size our community beds and building on the success of our urgent and community response and our virtual wards, but more importantly, how they are or are not adding value. But also looking at our point of prevalence, the criteria to admit and criteria to resign information, and where there's opportunities there to improve admission avoidance and discharge planning. What we do know is that this is only a start in our a deep dive into our ED and the opportunities, and we know we have to be brave and bold to fix our patient flow and shifting our care upstream. As we look at productivity challenges and opportunity across our group, this needs to build into our plans for 25-26. Thank you very much.
Really interesting. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Katie. Thank you to everyone who's doing this work behind the scenes. Questions and perspectives, interesting comments in the chat box. Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, the comments in the chat box unfortunately aren't there for the public to see. So I think
I'm just about to go to those, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think one of the issues for me on this is often, so just to reassure the public, when we talk about ambulances waiting outside ED departments, they will have been assessed on arrival. And often what happens is those patients are not crushing emergencies, they're waiting to be admitted to hospital, often frail older patients actually. So I think one of the best ways to address that is for patients to have the NHS brought to them if they're in a care home, or if we've done a call before convey, i.e. our consultants have advised the ambulance service on the correct treatment, those patients can go straight to our frailty unit. So there's quite a lot of additional activity that is not going through our A&E departments these days. It's going straight to same-day emergency care, straight to frailty. And I just wonder whether that's another angle on this that we could perhaps look at, particularly some of those older cohorts, the ability to bypass the ED, because it's not the best setting for them to go through in the first place. We can get them ideally treated in their place that they call home, or brought straight into frailty.
No, absolutely, Glenn. I mean, the Alex is a big outlier, as Karen points to in the chat box. Why do we think the Alex is such an outlier on the age profile? Chris?
Thanks, Chair. So partly it's driven by the pathway for our paediatric patients. The paediatric centralised mostly on the Worcestershire Royal site. So it will take out that younger age group, meaning that the older people who are attending the Alex
Okay,
skew the pathway.
It's just the maths, understand. Stephen, did you want to add anything to that?
It was that, and I think there's pathway changes as well. So a lot of the acute pathways come down here. The other bit is how we divert, and it links to Glenn's point. Quite often we're diverting the low acuity, frailer patients will get diverted up to the Alex, so it kind of skews it in a number of ways.
Yeah. And in terms, and I think the ambulance pit stop work is interesting in this regard, but Bart has asked the question, what percentage of patients could have been avoided from presenting at ED? I know it's still early doors, but on the ambulance pit stop work, what's that indicating in terms of patients who needn't have been put into an ambulance? Sarah, did you want to come into that?
Yeah, so we're looking at between 35 and 45% of all of those ambulances who are assessed. We will either take them back out into the community or they'll go into the SDEX.
Okay, great, thank you. Francis Martin?
Thank you, and thank you, colleagues, for a really fascinating piece of work. Like all of these, it asks more questions than answers, and so I recognise it wasn't part of the original brief, but building on Glenn's comments, I'd be really interested in understanding mortality and morbidity. There's been a lot of coverage nationally about the impact of long A&E waits and what that does, and if we could triangulate that, and I think it reinforces that hospitals are a great place if you need them and are really not a good place if you don't. And so everything we can do to avoid people spending, but significant impact, particularly on frail older people, of having an extended stay in ED. So I'd be grateful if we could look at that across the group.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's certainly one of the challenges. I mean, very, very, very big picture. What we know when we compare ourselves to European countries is we have less acute beds than almost every other European country. We also have, per capita, we also have the highest growing population within the major developed economies in Europe, and that's not going to change. So we've got less beds and we've got more demand because we've got a growing population. The maths dictate the only way we will be able to avoid total congestion of the acutes is by doing two things: admission prevention and flow efficiency, which goes back to the medically fit for discharge, minimising length of stay. So it's the simple maths of the flow efficiency dynamics which are important to us. But the more we can avoid people presenting, Sarah's 30 to 40%, who don't need to be presenting to ED, we're immediately making our life easier. Glenn?
I agree. I mean, there's a huge correlation between the quality of outcome and the cost, actually, when you look at this, because as you can see from the data, quite a lot of our capacity around ED is just holding patients, and that's not really providing any kind of progression in their discharge process to be home. So I think it's really important for us to do that. And I think we have to concentrate on those external factors, but also what this shows you is across group, there's still great opportunities to learn from each other, because we've got slightly different shapes of services going on and slightly different innovative approaches to this, that as long as we keep up with each other, we can kind of blend that together to do our very best under those kind of external circumstances.
Absolutely. And just trying to link it to what we were talking about in the workshop, Chris Douglas, who came up with the ambulance pit stop idea?
It came from Sarah, actually, working with Dan Hasty in terms of developing that idea. So it's come from teams working on the ground clinically. That's where the ideas have come from.
Absolutely. And one of the things John Drew was talking to us this morning about was how important taking those ideas from the teams and embedding them and testing them, piloting them, testing them, and then rolling them out to get real ownership amongst the team. So it's really great. So congratulations to Sarah and everyone, Claire, involved in all of that. Any other questions on this topic, guys? Okay, well, it's clearly for members of the public, you can see an area of endeavour which is going to be key for us to be able to provide the best possible care over the coming years for the citizens that we serve. So this is going to be a real area of attention across the Foundation Group. We'll move on then to the update on the equality, diversity and inclusion work that we're doing. Over to my Chief People Officer colleagues. Over to you.
Thanks, Russell. I'll make a start, and then my colleagues could come in towards the end of the discussion. So what I want to do is just share my screen, just go through the slides, putting out the key headlines, and then we can take it from there. So it's worthwhile to say that when we talking about EDI, it's really about the employee experience. So when you look at the performance measures on EDI, they are all geared towards enhancing the employee experience. So by attaining our EDI goals, we are in effect creating a psychologically safe and compassionate working environment for every single person. So it's just worthwhile to mention that from the outset. So what we've done is we've looked at some slides just to bring this to life and to talk about where we are at as a foundation group. So when you look at the core principles of the NHS Constitution, which talks about everyone belongs, and then when you look at some key 10 key areas to address and reduce health inequalities, it is clear to us that the foundation group is playing a key part in meeting the NHS Constitution and also in acting as an anchor organization. When you think about our strategic priorities, we've taken the right steps to reduce health inequalities in employment matters, in providing health and well-being programs for our staff, in procurement, in sustainability, in working in partnership with communities and the wider ICS. So when you look at all those 10 key drivers, you can point to the fact that the foundation group is playing a key part as an anchor organization. When you then look at the core principles, the core values of the NHS, which talks about compassion, talks about everyone belongs, talks about dignity and respect, you can see that those values are really embedded in our core values, our mission, and in our strategic pillars. So this slide just portrays the fact that as a foundation group, we have EDI at the core of the things that we do. Recently, a few months back, the NHS brought into effect 6 high-impact actions to show progress being made to address prejudice and discrimination within the health service. So you've got key objectives there for the board, EDI objectives. You've got to have fair and inclusive recruitment. You need to have an improvement plan on how you're addressing your pay gaps, how you're addressing health inequalities in the workforce, and also how you providing a program of support for your international staff and addressing bullying, discrimination, and violence in the workplace. So those are the key 6 high-impact actions. So across the foundation group, when you look at responses to EDI in the annual staff survey, when you look at the range of programs that we have in place, you can see that all 4 organizations are taking the right steps to address the EDI requirements from the People Promise. So this slide just gives you a snapshot overview of all the key programs that we have in place. I'm not going to go through line by line, but it's fair to say that we have comprehensive programs in place to address those high impact actions, and we are sharing best practice and working with our ICS colleagues across the foundation group. Then recently we've had a staff survey. You can see some good progress being made in terms of enhancing a good working environment and the culture within the organization across the foundation group. What we've then done is we've looked at the dashboard, so snapshot view of where we believe we are at this current time. And so you can see quite a lot of green areas, but there are also some amber areas. So there's still room for improvements. So certainly we are working as a group to really look at those amber areas and to turn those ambers into greens over the coming year. If you look at the final point on this slide, how you addressing bullying, discrimination, harassment, and physical violence, that's going to be one of our top priorities for the next 12 months, because we now have the Sexual Safety Charter, we now have the policy in place, and we put in programs in place. Civility Saves Lives, Active Bystander Program, training our staff on violence, resilience. So that's a key area that we're going to focus on over the next year. And really, in terms of the actions going forward, it is clear that we recognize and understand our responsibilities and obligations from an EDI perspective. We've taken the right steps to become a more inclusive and compassionate employer, and we will continue to do so. And we all understand and acknowledge the fact that it's a collective effort for us to ensure that we continue promoting good relations, we continue promoting an inclusive working environment, and we ensure that we maintain our zero tolerance stance to any discrimination, harassment, bullying, or victimization in the workplace. So that's really all I wanted to pull out from the slides, Russell. I don't know if my colleagues want to come in and add any more stuff. I'll stop sharing now.
A great summary. Thank you, Geoffrey. Any questions or perspectives from CPO colleagues? Ali, terrible feedback. Sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Thank you, Chair. I think the only comment I would add is whilst we are seeing positive progress in those high-level impact actions, there is still such a long way to go. And for every incident that we may have reported or hear about where a colleague has experienced unsatisfactory behaviour, discrimination or harassment on any level, either from other staff or from members of the public, for every single incidence of that, it signals to us loud and clear that we need to do more. So there is always more work to do in this area, and we're very cognizant of that. And I think respective teams in each of our trusts and organisations take that obligation really seriously.
No, it's great to hear. Thank you, Ali. Sue Whelan-Tracy.
Yes, it was good to hear in workshop about the Freedom to Speak Up work undergone at George Eliot in terms of training for all members of staff being mandatory. I just wanted to comment that it is often our managers that building their confidence to actually listen to these difficult and complex situations and act on them is key. So I just wondered whether or not that training is likely to be rolled out at Swift.
Okay, thank you, Sue. Elva?
Yeah, so that's something we are looking at, and it's just we've recently had a new learning management system in which we're trying to look at ensuring we've got the relevant packages on there. So certainly something which we're hoping to roll out as part of that mandatory element, but also I was just going to make a point as well with regards to the freedom to speak up and that triangulation of that wider data around the freedom to speak up, the experiences our staff are having, and making sure that we're taking it from different angles to get to where we're where we need to be in terms of moving forward with some of those key high impact actions as well.
Thank you. And any other questions or perspectives? I'd just like to sort of contextualize things a bit, because I do think, and one sees in the press at the moment lots of comments about EDI. The issue of EDI is a moral issue. It's about regarding everyone as equal. It's not it might be, if you like, trendy in a particular form of language, which is trendy at the moment, but it's a moral issue. It's absolutely right that whatever one's background is, sex is, racial heritage is, religious beliefs are, that everyone is regarded as an individual with their own worth. And when it comes to work, absolutely focusing on competence, how hard people work, and the values that they display. So it's really important to say to members of the public that it's not just because we hear in the press often about equality, diversity and inclusion that we talk about these things, but it's absolutely a moral issue within the foundation group. It's the right thing to be focusing on. All our colleagues should feel safe, should feel valued, and should be treated with kindness and compassion. The second aspect is it's a piece of work which has enlightened self-interest for us as a group. I want us as a group to attract the most talented individuals we can. And I'm sure I can speak on Glenn's behalf. You know, certainly in terms of my own education, I didn't go to a good school. I wasn't brought up with a plum in my mouth. You know, and we can all look at our own backgrounds. It's all about talent. And equality, diversity and inclusion, where we create a culture where everyone feels valued for their own self-worth and contribution and feel free to speak up, as Elva's indicated, is absolutely about creating a work environment where people want to work with us, love working with us, talk to others about the benefits of working with us, and therefore we have great staff retention and less sickness. So it's a moral issue and it's an issue of self-enlightenment. It's not a trendy issue. Okay, team. Well, with that said, because we'll maybe come back to that a little bit under the questions a bit later, we'll move on then to some items for approval. And the first up is the schedule of business for next year, which I will take as read, unless Sarah Collette or Gwenny want to add anything to it. So it's always a bit frightening when you see your year headlined out. If you're not happy to approve, please raise a digital hand. Otherwise, I do expect us all to be at every single meeting. Only joking. Okay, can't see any hands raised, so that's duly approved. We'll then move on to the annual review of board committee terms of reference. Sarah and Gwenny, how would you like to handle this?
Shall I take it, Gwenny, and then you add anything?
Yes, please, Sarah.
So the each committee across the foundation group have considered the terms of reference. So in front of you, you've got audit committee terms of reference, appointments and remuneration committee, and also the foundation group strategy committee terms of reference. So the proposed amendments are there as track changes. There's for consideration and approval. There's also an update on the charity trustee terms of reference, which will go through to the individual charity trustees for approval, and an update on the quality committee terms of reference, which will go through the individual quality committees and then to the boards for approval separately. Gwenny, is there anything you wanted to add?
Only that the amendments we've made to the audit committee are to bring it closely into line with the code of governance. So there's nothing different from that code of governance.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Gwenny. Any questions or perspectives on the changes highlighted to the terms of reference to the subcommittees? If you're not happy to approve, could you please raise a digital hand? Okay, duly approved. Thank you very much. Then we'll move on to the report from the strategy committee report from the meeting on the 17th of December, where we talked about group job planning, group procurement, clinical training and education, and aseptic services. as well as the prostate cancer pathways and project scope, as well as some other developments. I'll take it all as read, but any questions or perspectives? Okay, so I think therefore, team, we are on to any other business. Any other business? Please raise a digital hand. Just a few from me. The first is an enormous vote of thanks to Simon Page and Sue Whelan-Tracy. This is their last for board meeting with the foundation group. Would just like to thank them very much for their hard work over the last 9 years, and wish you very well for the future. Would like to congratulate Chris Douglas for taking the position of Interim Chief Operating Officer, Worcestershire Acute, and Julia Bartlett for becoming our Chief Strategy Officer over Worcestershire Acute as well. So well done, team. And we wish you all well in pastures new, or pastures with us, but still pastures new. So questions from members of the public or Swift governors. I think we've had a few questions come in from members of the public. Sarah, do you want to read them out for us, please?
Okay, so the first one is, do any of the hospitals in the foundation group allow members of staff who are trans-identifying men, i.e. biological males, to use the women's, i.e. biological females, changing rooms and toilets? If so, which hospitals in the foundation group allow this?
Okay, I want to make a general point before we give some specific answers. The first is we greatly value, as we just talked about on the EDI agenda, people of different races, different racial heritages, different sexual orientations, trans people, people of different religious beliefs. And we treat everyone with respect and kindness. Certainly at Swift, our position is for members of staff to choose the toilet which they think best reflects their gender. And this is a difficult issue. It's a difficult issue for everyone, but that's the position we take, and we treat everyone with equal respect and dignity. And I believe that's the position across the rest of the foundation group. And that will continue to be our position. We are, for example, with the new builds going on at Warwick Hospital, introducing gender neutral toilets, which makes it a less difficult issue if it's difficult in any way for anyone. Any other questions from members of the public?
The second one we've had is, will the board engage in talks with Worcestershire County Council to consider the possibility of the NHS purchasing the land at the County Hall estate currently used as a car park to be used by visitors to Worcestershire Royal Hospital, thus easing parking problems at the hospital?
It's a great question. Who are we lined up to answer it? Sarah?
Stephen, I believe.
Well done, Steve. If only it was so easy, Stephen.
Yeah. So we've got a number of discussions with a number of different partners. They're quite commercial in nature, so can't really get into a lot of detail. But they are a public sector body. We've worked really closely with them on car parking, so we'll keep really tight to it, and we'll keep members of the public updated as we're improving, particularly on the Worcester Royal site, which we should expect to happen quite shortly.
I think it's fair to say, Stephen, on behalf of you, Glenn and I, that this has been an area of immense frustration for us. We have applied a lot of time, but it is like walking through treacle. So I absolutely understand members of the public and staff still being frustrated and still challenging us. And I'm very happy, even at every Worcestershire board, if different members of staff insist the board answer the same question. Okay. Just to keep us honest, to use an old-fashioned phrase. Any other questions, Sarah?
None received, no.
Okay, as we've got members of the public with us, if any members of the public want to ask a question now, please raise a digital hand. Okay, I can't see any hands raised, so I'll draw the meeting to a close. Thank members of the public for joining us and suggest to board colleagues that we meet again at 3:10. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you at the next meeting, which is on the 7th of May at 1:30, again on Microsoft Teams. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much for your hard work. See you in 10 minutes for board colleagues. Bye-bye.